Richard Rick Wilson sat in his 12-year-old Ford pickup truck, trying to muster up the courage. Courage is such a strange word for an action that Rick was considering. When did life become so hopelessly overwhelming that it seemed like the only way out? Rick grew up in a nice house with 2 younger brothers and 2 wonderful parents. An excellent student and all-around athlete, Rick was popular in high school. In his young life, he experienced only 2 injuries. The first was when his high school girlfriend, whom he thought he would marry someday, broke up with him a month before the prom. Carrie gave him an old cliche: "I think it's important for us to meet other people to make sure that we really love each other." Rick had the audacity to come to the dance with her new college-age boyfriend. It took most of the following summer and the support of his family to get rid of the vision of the love of his life, hugging a college student's neck as they twirled and kissed on the dance floor. The second one was a year later. What was there in May? Rick was playing for his high school baseball team when a ball hit him in his right ear. The bone surrounding the ear was shattered. Now he was deaf in that ear. And worst of all, the recovery time prevented the college scouts from seeing his pitch. The scholarships Rick was counting on to pay for college tuition never materialized. Without a scholarship, Rick enrolled in a public college and had just started his senior year when the Twin Towers were destroyed. On September 14th, Rick entered the office of a local recruiter with a firm intention of enlisting in the Army. It never occurred to him that he would not be suitable. He was a model of early manhood, 180 centimeters tall and weighing 90 kilograms. He could bench press 120 kilograms and run half a kilometer in 58 seconds. The recruiter shook his hand and was kind enough to say, "Thanks, son. We'd be glad if you joined the team," before rejecting him due to deafness in his right ear. Rick never shared his rejection with anyone. There was no logical reason for secrecy. He certainly had no reason to be ashamed of his physical inferiority. He just couldn't get rid of the feeling of inferiority and carried it deep in his soul for years. Rick graduated in finance and started working at the local branch of the growing Washington Mutual Bank. It was 2003. And the mortgage lending market was experiencing tumultuous events. It was not unusual for Rick to close a dozen mortgages every week in addition to numerous secondary mortgages and real estate loans. The economy was growing. Rick felt good because he was helping people buy their dream homes or using the capital of their homes to buy things: boats, new cars, swimming pools that the average working-class person could not have dreamed of before this economic boom. It was a year after graduation when Rick met Stacy Wallace. He was playing away in the adult baseball league when he saw a pretty brunette in a modest blouse and not so modest summer shorts in the stands with the wife of one of his teammates. After the game, Jeff and Jenny introduced Rick to Stacy and asked if he would like to join the 3 of them at a local pub to have a bottle of beer. Rick and Stacy were sitting at a table with their drinks waiting, while Jeff and Jenny were talking to another couple at the bar. It was Stacy who broke the ice. "It's been at least 3 years since they last introduced me." Rick laughed. "They didn't even try to show any sophistication. But that's fine with me. I hope you don't mind." It was Stacy's turn to laugh. Rick noticed how her blue eyes seemed to shine when she laughed. "More than fine. In fact, it's much better than last time." I don't want to be rude, but he was very pleased with himself. I couldn't get a word in while he was telling me how wonderful he was. Well, it's easy to see why. He was trying his best to impress the beautiful lady. Stacy blushed. "Our flattery instead of bragging. Is this your move?" As soon as she said that, Stacy blushed even more than before. Her cheeks were practically flushed when she apologized. "I'm sorry, Rick. It was mean of me. I'm a little nervous, and it didn't sound like that at all. Are you nervous? What are you nervous about? I've been nervous ever since Jenny pointed you out on the field and said we'd go for a walk after that. I've been watching you play and I wondered if you'd be disappointed. Rick looked at Stacy and wondered which planet this woman had come from. She was 170 centimeters tall and maybe 55 kilograms of beauty. How could this woman not know how attractive she was? Why would I be disappointed? Stacy hadn't finished her first bottle and still felt like her lips were ahead of her mind. She said the first thing that came to her mind, "Well, look at you. You're great." Rick couldn't believe it. Now it was his turn to blush. Oh, flattery. Does it work for you? It was the perfect moment for Jeff and Jenny to join them at the table. Jenny looked at them both, trying to figure out if this was another one of her failed attempts to play Cupid. What happened? Jeff shot Jenny a stern look and was ready to tell her, "See, I told you to mind your own business." But before he could say a word, Stacy interrupted him. "Thank God you two are back. Rick and I were ready to embarrass ourselves for the next decade." Jenny was confused and went back to her normal routine whenever she was confused. "Come with me. I need to go to the ladies' room." She tugged on Stacy's arm and headed for the bathroom. Rick looked at Jeff. The ladies' room? Jeff could only shake his head. 3 years of marriage to Jenny had taught him when to keep his mouth shut. Don't ask. Would. Rick finished the first bottle, noticed that Jeff's glass was almost empty, and ordered 2 more from a passing waitress. "I like her. She's funny, pretty, and there's something in those eyes and smile. Jenny will be happy. Her track record and this kind of thing sucks." "Are you going to tell me why she's still single?" "For the same reason as you. There are a lot of losers and users in the world. It's hard to find a suitable match. It seems you've found what you need. I envy you and Jenny." Jeff smiled back. "I'm a lucky guy. So, do you think I get good grades?" Rick nodded toward the bathroom door. "I'd be surprised if that wasn't the case. I was watching you two while I was at the bar. There is some chemistry between you." Jeff looked up. "Here they come." Both ladies returned to the table and both were grinning. If there were any doubts, Stacy dispelled them by moving her chair a little closer to Rick's. For the next 2 hours, the 4 of them drank, talked, and laughed. That was the beginning. Since that evening, Rick and Stacy have become a couple. Stacy taught language arts in junior high. We used to call it English, and attended graduate classes in the summer. Despite the fact that Rick's regular work week consisted of 50-odd hours at his desk and at least one evening at the branch, they still found time to be together every weekend and at least 2 evenings a week. Their romance grew stronger, and as in any great novel, obstacles had to be overcome. The biggest obstacle was Stacy's father, Colonel Wallace. The colonel was a stern army officer who had little respect for civilians, especially civilian men who have never served. More than once, Rick thought about telling the colonel why he didn't serve, but given some of the colonel's outlandish statements about slackers, he realized that it wouldn't change anything for the old man. Besides, as far as he could tell, despite growing up in the army, Stacy didn't seem to share her father's views on the matter, and the colonel didn't interfere with their budding romance. Thanks to hard work and the desire to please each other, things in the bedroom area continued to improve. Rick and Stacy discovered that they have a lot in common, such as their values and hopes for the future. Will they have 2 children or 3? Will they raise their children as Catholics or Methodists? It didn't matter to either of them, as long as the children grew up with a moral compass that led them through the maze of life. After 6 months of dating, 5 months after they had sworn to each other in exclusivity, Rick asked for Stacy's hand in marriage. Stacy said yes, and 4 months later Rick and Stacy got married and went to Jamaica on their honeymoon. Rick had never shared this with anyone, but the most beautiful thing he had experienced up to this point in his life was that morning when his sweet, conservative wife took off her top while relaxing on a public beach. In addition, she enjoyed watching her new husband's eyes practically pop out of their sockets, almost like watching a Warner Brothers cartoon. A week spent under the Caribbean sun, with sand, warm water, drinks and food, was the perfect way for these two lovely children to start a family life. Rick couldn't believe that such a gorgeous woman, both inside and out, had agreed to become his life partner. One day, when they were splashing in the clear water, Rick was amazed that Stacy's eyes shone with the same shade of blue as the Caribbean Sea. He could see himself growing old with her as those eyes smiled at him. At evening, watching Stacy take off the sundress she wore to dinner, he realized that he was very lucky. Stacy undressed as slowly as she could, considering that she was wearing only a dress, panties, and sandals. Stacy had only 2 lovers before meeting Rick. She was one of those rare girls who graduated from high school and the first 2 years of college and still remained virgins. Both boys were clumsy, and neither of them had the skills or equipment to satisfy her. Now it's in the past. Rick was an attentive lover. The honeymoon was over, and they returned home, determined to build a life together. Looking back, you can afford the luxury of 50-50, and it's easy to find fault with the decisions that Rick and Stacy made over the next few years. But if all the great minds at the Federal Reserve Bank, the Treasury Department, Congress, the White House, and almost every financial institution could have missed the impending wave of events that led to the Great Recession, can we really expect more from 2 people who trust these great minds? It was 2007, and like many young couples that year, as house prices continued to rise to obscene levels, Rick and Stacy panicked and bought a house when the market peaked. Why keep throwing money away by renting a place when they could create capital? The house they bought, a modest 3-bedroom duplex, in 2003 would probably have cost $200,000 by the time the Wilsons bought it in 2007, winning the bidding for the right to buy. The closing price was $420,000. The realtor told them that they were lucky to steal it at such a low price. Right after they bought their first house and took out a mortgage, Stacy came up with an idea that they thought was brilliant. Stacy quit teaching for 1 year, earning her master's degree in 1 year instead of 3 years of summer school. As a bonus, she would use this year to get pregnant and spend a few months with a baby before returning to work. After receiving her master's degree, she would have received a good salary increase and would have been able to teach in high school. They wrote it all down on paper: deadlines, finances, logistics. All this was drawn in pencil. Rick was doing a fantastic job. He recently got a good raise to his base salary and a bonus. They did it all right. Everything one is expected, almost like clockwork. It was late November when Stacy told Rick that her period was 3 weeks late and bought a test kit to confirm it. There couldn't have been a better time. The baby was due in mid-July. Stacy could spend 2 months with her newborn before returning to teaching, as they had planned. The most thoughtful plans so often go awry. In April 2008, the mortgage market began to collapse. Washington Mutual began closing offices and laying off people, especially in mortgage departments. Rick was one of them. Rick eventually remained unemployed for 5 months before eventually getting a job as one of 2 assistant managers at a discount department store. The salary was about half of what Rick earned at the bank. The assistant managers had to change shifts every month and assign responsibilities on weekends. On May 15, Stacy went into labor. Amy Wilson was born 7 weeks prematurely. It was 3 weeks before the Wilsons were able to bring Amy home to the nursery that Stacy and Rick had designed for their little girl. The hospital bills were piling up. Rick's Cobra insurance paid some of the bills, but not as much as his previous policy holder would have paid. Stacy did finish that semester and got a teaching position at a local high school. This gave her the opportunity to spend 10 weeks at home with Amy before the start of the school year. Stacy's mom agreed to look after Amy when Rick was working the day shift at the store. They had 2 incomes, but still not enough to pay all the bills. They had problems with a mortgage, and it was impossible to sell the house. Amy had a number of health problems, colic, ear infections, and so on, which prevented any of them from getting a good night's sleep. The weight of it all continued to weigh on Rick and Stacy. Weeks passed without any physical intimacy between them, working a shift from 16 to 2,300 hours every 2 months and a large number of weekends greatly reduced the time that Rick could spend with Stacy. The best lovers became roommates. The tiny cracks in the Wilsons' marriage began to widen during Stacy's sophomore year of high school teaching. That was the year Kyle Turner, the new physical education teacher, arrived at the school. Kyle was a fantastic specimen. He is 190 centimeters tall, weighs 100 kilograms, and is built like a midfielder. Long blonde hair, and for some reason always with a light stubble on his face, just enough to give him a stern look. Teachers, young and old, began whispering about the young teacher after the first day of preparation for the new academic year. Since these were preparatory days, 2 weeks before the first day of classes, almost everyone was dressed casually. Stacy was wearing shorts, not Daisy Dukes, but short enough to show off her long tan legs. Stacy's top was just as form-fitting, unbuttoned just above where her cleavage would have been visible if she had been over. She couldn't dress like this when classes started, but after spending the summer getting her body back into the shape it was before pregnancy, she felt she deserved to show off a little. She never expected that a handsome guy like Kyle Turner would be sitting in class that first day. Cal noticed Stacy right away. He saw her legs, her breasts, her pretty face, and the rings on her left hand. The rings didn't upset him. Stacy wouldn't be the first married woman to attract Kyle's attention. Kyle's pursuit of Stacy began on the very first day, slowly at first. Because he had all the time in the world, he had already made love to his neighbor, who was also a biology teacher here. Besides, half the fun was in the chase. Rumors began to spread that first week, and no one knew where from. Presumably, Kyle was a former Special Forces Ranger or Navy SEAL. Everyone who heard this story was impressed and had no doubt that it must be true. It was just the way Kyle behaved that created this horror. This is a man who faced danger and returned home, became a teacher, and will help young people grow up like him. Kyle didn't spread rumors. He wasn't stupid, but he never denied anything. He never talked about how he spent 3 years in the Navy anyway. His silence only increased the mystery and made him seem humble. The truth was that Kyle Turner had spent those 3 years working at a supply depot in the States. It was the perfect job for him. Right after graduating from high school, he realized that he hated military life. Working in a supply warehouse meant that he never had to fire a gun or be in the vicinity of any action. It also allowed him to spend a couple of hours in the base gym every day. There's nothing shameful about how Kyle spent those 3 years, as long as he was honest when asked. It was as if fate was working against the Wilson marriage. Stacy and Kyle had the same free time every day, right before lunch break. Once Kyle was convinced that Stacy couldn't wait to continue her workouts, he suggested that she visit the school gym on Tuesdays and Thursdays when the room was free. Upon working out with you instead of the sweaty shorts and eggers I usually go up to the gym with, and maybe I can help you with your workouts. It made a lot of sense, and that's how Stacy ended up spending 2 hours a week with Kyle. One day in February, Kyle surprised Stacy when they were training. I was writing a short novel. I finished the first draft, and I'd like to know if you could read it and share your thoughts with me. Stacy reacted exactly the way Kyle wanted her to. She didn't treat him like an illiterate physical education teacher. I would love to. What is he talking about? This is a story about the war, but that's all I want to say. I would prefer that you read this without any preconceived opinions. I can do it. I'll bring it after the last lesson. Thank you. That evening, while Rick was at work and after Amy went to bed, Stacy started reading Kyle's short novel about Navy SEALs in Iraq. Stacy finished the first half before Rick got home. She could have finished it that night, but writing notes in the margins for Kyle's second draft slowed her down. The main character's name was Tyler, and Stacy couldn't help but believe that Tyler was Kyle's alias and wondered if this story was true. Of course, this is exactly what Kyle had in mind when he wrote the story and asked Stacy to revise it for him. Stacy thought that the name Tyler was a clever combination of Turner and Kyle. Rick was working the next night. Amy was in bed, and Stacy was reading the second half of the novel. This second half contained a chapter describing Tyler's exploits in Italy. The passage was very passionate. Stacy dropped her editing pen, and her fingers were inside her pajama bottoms before she realized it. Tyler had never had any problems finding a good woman to spend days and nights with during previous business trips, but the 3 weeks he spent in Italy after 5 months of defeating the Taliban exceeded all expectations. It started on the first night in Amalfi. She and Greg North were sitting in a small cafe, having a drink after dinner when 2 young ladies came up to their table. "Are you 2 Americans?" the brunette asked. Her English was good, but there was an accent, probably French. They were introduced to each other. 2 women, they really were French, joined them. Brunette Michelle seemed to have her eye on Tyler, and blonde Leslie looked at Greg. They drank, then found a nightclub where they danced until 3 a.m. Tyler and Greg escorted the ladies to the dock where their small yacht was moored. "Is this yours?" Greg asked. Leslie answered, "This is my father's. He allowed us to use it for a month. Why don't you come back tomorrow morning and we'll go on a cruise?" Tyler and Greg were disappointed that they weren't invited to spend the night, but agreed to return the next morning. This was the last time any of them were disappointed for the next 3 weeks. In the morning, the 2 men headed to the pier, holding their breath in the hope that the yacht would still be there. It was 2 women stood on the deck in identical blue bikinis and waved them on board. 5 minutes after they boarded, each man had a glass in his hand. The women took off their t-shirts and the boat headed out of the harbor. Tyler couldn't help but thank the stars for starting a fantastic day. Her brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail and her blue eyes were hidden behind aviator-style sunglasses. It was a beautiful day on the Mediterranean Sea, calm blue water and beautiful sun. As soon as the boat was far enough away from the shore to be able to retire, both ladies took off their swimming trunks and went skinny dipping. Tyler and Greg undressed and joined them. Michelle swam up to Tyler and wrapped her legs around his waist. Since neither of them had any fat, Tyler had to kick as hard as he could to keep both from drowning. "That's not going to work, is it?" She laughed, and the words sounded prettier because of her accent. "Let's go up to the swimming deck." They swam to the stern of the boat. Tyler sat on the back edge of the platform, and his feet were still in the water. He reached out to Michelle and lifted her right out of the water. Michelle couldn't help but be impressed by Tyler's strength. This man's stunning physique was more than just for show. There was strength in his muscles. Tyler and Michelle continued to move in tandem, enjoying the sensations. The lovers kissed and then laughed. Michelle leaned back until she fell off Tyler's lap into the sea. Tyler leaned forward to follow her. By the time Tyler and Michelle returned to the yacht, Greg and Leslie were leaving the cabin on the main deck, still completely naked. Leslie dragged Michelle into the cabin for a moment. When they came out, Greg and Tyler were still standing there, wondering, "What's next?" "Michelle and I were hoping that you two would like to spend your 3 weeks on tour with us on our boat. We will return to the shore. You will be able to check and pick up your gear, and we will go on a tour of the Mediterranean together. What do you think?" Tyler and Greg looked at each other, nodded in silent agreement, then both answered in unison, "Amit, yes." So began the most daring tour that either of the two seals had ever experienced. Stacy read the next few pages, which described in detail the lovemaking between Tyler and Michelle. Now, every time she read the name Michelle, she substituted her own name and imagined that Tyler was using her. Stacy imagined Kyle's arms around her. 2 days later, when Stacy returned his draft, Kyle was able to say that the story had the desired effect. Stacy blushed as she handed it to him. "Did you like it?" Kyle tried his best to keep a smirk off his face. "I liked it. It's a great story and a good first draft. I made some suggestions and comments in the margins." "It's not too much, is it?" "I didn't know if I needed to soften the sex scenes between Tyler and Michelle." Stacy blushed even more. "Oh no, I think it added the right shade. There is nothing wrong with making love between consenting adults. It adds a spark." "I've always thought so." Stacy caught Kyle's hint. It was as thin as a train wreck, but it also gave her pleasure. If there were any doubts about Kyle's intentions, this conversation dispelled them. If Stacy hadn't been a married woman, Kyle would have used her that night. Stacy began to think in such terms. Why did I get married so young? Was Rick really the right man for me? Rick seemed so weak and moody when you compare him to Kyle. Kyle saw the danger and reacted so courageously. Rick has never done anything remotely dangerous. Stacy's relationship with Rick had deteriorated to the point where they barely spoke. Rick was tired of being talked down to, and communication was now limited to Amy's departure and schedule. As the wall between them grew higher, the flirting and intimacy between Stacy and Kyle intensified at school. Danielle Miller was one of the teachers who watched the two lovebirds. Danielle was Kyle's neighbor and biology teacher, whom Kyle briefly courted and slept with until Kyle realized that he had a real chance to get into Stacy's panties. Danielle hated Stacy, and it didn't help when Kyle threw her like a rock, only to see him target misses. Perfect. Worse, this spring, Stacy was chosen as the women's tennis coach, not Danielle. Kyle's first mistake was playing where you work. His second mistake was unceremoniously abandoning a jealous woman. And his third mistake was not knowing that the uncle of the woman in question was a U.S. congressman. A week after the phone call to Uncle Fred, Danielle received all the necessary information, watching the novel unfold. She knew it wouldn't be for long. She would wait for the romance to get stronger and then ruin two lives. It's been 6 weeks since Stacy read his story. 6 weeks of flirting. Kyle had had enough. The time has come. Stacy, you've been teasing me long enough. I'm going to book a table for dinner on Thursday night. I know it's your book club night. I read your diary. We're going to have dinner at Carmen's, then we'll go across the street to the Hilton. I'm going to make love to you like no one has ever done before. Stacy didn't mind Kyle's demands. All she could think about was how courageous and strong her future lover could be. How different he is from Rick. Rick always asked, and Kyle always told. She had only one question. Why the hotel? Why not your apartment? Because there are 3 more teachers living in my complex. I assume you don't want to be seen going in and out of my apartment. At least not yet. As long as you're married to that loser. Stacy couldn't help but smile at how Kyle reacted to her situation. It never occurred to her that she should defend her husband after Kyle called Rick a loser, and Kyle couldn't help but smile to himself. Once again, he was able to tell some stupid woman that they had a future without actually saying those words. A future he wasn't going to make permanent. He would have enjoyed making love to this woman for several months before moving on to the next conquest. Stacy was already late for practice. The girls would be waiting, so she made a decision. It's a date. Rick and Stacy were in the kitchen on Thursday morning, drinking coffee. Amy was eating her cereal as usual, making a mess. Rick, don't forget that I have a book club after tennis practice tonight. You'll need to pick Amy up from mom before 6 and feed her. I'll be home by 10. I can do it. What book are you discussing tonight? The question made Stacy pause. Was it a trick question? Stacy took a sip of coffee to take advantage of the moment and pull herself together before answering. But there was still irritation in her tone. Water for elephants. Why are you asking? You're not usually interested in my book club. Rick was a little taken aback by Stacy's tone, but realized that it just symbolized her attitude towards him lately. I didn't mean anything by it. I'm just trying to be polite. Rick picked up his lunch from the counter, kissed Amy on the top of her head, and got the hell out of the house before he lost his temper. Rick's quick departure did not escape Stacy. At first, she was angry at Rick for leaving without saying goodbye. And then she realized that she probably hadn't said anything nice to Rick in weeks. Before the first lesson, Kyle looked into Stacy's room. He looked around the room to make sure no one was eavesdropping on him. We have a reservation at Carmen's for 6. And the room across the street at the Hilton. Don't be late for dinner. I know you need to come home tonight, and I need every minute I spend with you to make up for the months I've been waiting to be alone with you. I have to be home by 10 o'clock. Can we skip dinner? Stacy laughed softly. The door was still open. Nice try, buddy. But I'm looking forward to a nice dinner with a glass or 2 of good wine and no kids. And that too. Now get out of here. Stacy didn't know how she managed to keep her cool all day and during tennis practice. She dismissed the team a few minutes earlier, at 10 minutes to 5. Everything was going according to plan. After tennis practice, Stacy waited until all the girls had finished in the locker room before changing out of sweatpants into the little black dress she had last worn when Rick took her to the Crystal Room on New Year's Eve. When was that? Almost 3 years ago, when they had money for such things. That was the last time she wore 10-centimeter heels and thigh-high black stockings. Stacy took one last look at herself in the full-length mirror. She knew Carl Turner would love what he saw tonight and would love it even more when the dress came off. Stacy stared at her reflection and tried to calm herself down. I deserve it. The clothes she wore to school that day were in a small travel suitcase. She showered and changed at the hotel before heading home. Her hair was pulled back in a stylish ponytail, which eliminated the need to shampoo and dry it afterwards. Stacy left the building, locked the doors behind her, and headed for her car when a blue Honda pulled up. Angel Martinez, one of the high school tennis team, practically jumped out of the Honda. Mrs. Wilson, thank God I caught you before you left. I left my ethics textbook and notes in my locker and I have a test tomorrow. Can you let me in so I can take it? You are welcome. Stacy was embarrassed to be caught by one of her students in such an outfit. She told Angel to follow her and headed back to the locker room, and Angel chatted nonstop the whole way. Mrs. Wilson, you look so elegant today. On a weekday evening, are you and Mr. Wilson celebrating something special today? For example, an anniversary or something like that. Before Stacy could answer, Angel continued chatting. I used to be very embarrassed when my mom and dad went outside like that. Mom would wear something nice and dad would wear a nice sports jacket. They'd come home and it was like rent a room because they'd hug and kiss. And I was at an age when you couldn't stand the thought of your parents doing this, right? Angel was talking louder now because Stacy was at the door and Angel was at her locker. Angel returned with a book and a notebook in her hands, continuing to talk. Then, when I was old enough to understand it, I was kind of proud of them. Here they are, after almost 20 years of marriage and 3 children, and they still love each other. Isn't that cool? Now they were sitting in their cars and Angel was looking straight into Stacy's eyes. Have fun tonight, Mrs. Wilson. I saw your husband. He's handsome. No wonder you two are still going on. And she left. Stacy stood by her car with the door open and lost her temper, crying uncontrollably and talking to herself. What a stupid, selfish fool I was. Do I deserve this? Is that what I told myself? What I deserve is to lose my family for what I was going to do. When did I become so selfish? No one answered Stacy's questions. It took her a good 10 minutes before her tears dried up and she could start driving home. She was so upset that she didn't even pay attention to how she was dressed. All she wanted to do was hug her husband and child. Rick spent the day feeling depressed. How did his life turn into such a burden? Where was the joy? The bills just kept piling up. The little things that once made life worth fighting for are mostly gone. Especially the love he and Stacy once shared. He's been able to come to terms with it for most of the last 2 years. He owed it to his little girl to be strong. But at least since February, Stacy hadn't been able to look him in the eye or give him the love he needed. Rick left work earlier than usual. To hell with it all. He thought he was thinking of going to the pub for a bottle of beer before going to his mother-in-law's to pick up Amy. Instead, he decided to go home and enjoy a couple of hours of peace and quiet. It turned out to be a big mistake. Rick picked up the mail from a mailbox on the street and made the mistake of opening 2 envelopes with the word overdue on the outside of each. How fucking embarrassing. Rick went inside, read both letters, and wondered where he was going to get another $1,500 by the end of the month. Rick walked past the refrigerator with 2 cans of cheap Blogger and reached for the top shelf above the stove, where they kept a bottle of bourbon just in case the Colonel came to visit. An overwhelming feeling of despair and depression gripped him after he drank the first portion of bourbon. He poured a second helping. Rick has been thinking about this a lot in the last 3 months. He knew the why. He knew the how. The only solution left until tonight was when. Why? The main reason is that dead Rick was worth more than alive. The Wilson family's dire financial situation would have been improved by an infusion of capital once the life insurance was paid. Another reason is that life just wasn't worth it anymore. Rick is tired of playing Sisyphus, rolling a stone up a slope only to have it roll back over and over again. It was tolerable when he did it on the team with Stacy by his side, easing the load with his smiles and love. But at least for the last 6 months he has been pushing this rock uphill alone. How? It took a lot more thinking. It would hurt Amy if she grew up and ever found out that her father committed suicide. The second reason was financial. Rick's life insurance policy for $250,000 would have paid off twice if death had occurred as a result of an accident. The perfect solution, like many other perfect solutions, was right in front of him. Every day, on the way to and from the city, Rick passed the Dead Man's Turn. The Dead Man's Turn got its name after the second of the two cars fell off a cliff into the gorge below. It was a dangerous stretch of the old road between downtown and the development where the Wilsons lived. A few years ago, the city created an alternative to the city center after it decided that the Department of Highways could not fix the turn and make it safe. The city even considered closing the road, but too many people complained about the closure as the alternative method of transportation took an extra 12 minutes to get to the city center. The city left it open, installed cheap fencing, and lowered the speed limit on the turn to 25 kilometers per hour. There was still the question of when, which Rick answered when he finished his second bourbon. There is no time like the present. Maybe he said it out loud, but there was no one in the kitchen to hear him, so maybe it was just in his head. Rick picked up the keys to his pickup truck. The car would have no problems overcoming flimsy obstacles on the turn. Rick stopped when he opened the door. Would 2 servings of bourbon affect his blood alcohol level to the point where he would be considered an imbecile? Will this affect the payment of insurance? Rick decided it wasn't worth the risk. He ran back into the house, went to the toilet, rinsed his mouth, and washed the glass before putting it away. 10 minutes later, Rick was sitting in the car with the engine idling, looking at the turn and gathering the courage to take the plunge. Stacy decided to take the shortest route home to save a few precious minutes, even though she rarely used the old road. Tonight was an exception. She was in a hurry to get home before Rick so that she could take off her cheating outfit and look like a mom and wife. Stacy rounded the corner and slowed down to make the turn when she saw Rick's car on the other side. Why was he here? It was in the opposite direction from her mother's house. The car had just started moving when Stacy hit the horn. Rick did not notice the approach of another car when he finally decided to continue driving. His foot moved from the brake to the gas pedal, and his left foot released the clutch, and he set off. Suddenly, his subconscious registered a sound, and his gaze focused on a car heading in his direction. Startled, Rick slammed on the brakes. What the hell was Stacy's car doing here? He looked out the open driver's side window and saw Stacy in her car parked next to him. Rick, what are you doing here? Rick shook his head. He was so determined to overcome his fear of death that he seemed drugged with illegal substances. He just stared at his wife, trying to figure out what she was saying. Rick, where's Amy? A terrible thought occurred to her. Stacy jumped out of the car and ran to Rick's car, peering into the cabin. Rick still hasn't said a word. He was just looking at his wife in that beautiful dress. Richard, come home. We need to talk. Stacy returned to her car and waited for him to turn his car around before following him home. As soon as she entered the house, she went to their bedroom to change, and then 5 minutes later she entered the kitchen where Rick was sitting at the table. She quickly called her mother. Mom, could you leave Amy for the evening, please? Then she sat down. Before she could say a word, Rick spoke up. She looked good this evening. I haven't seen this dress since you were pregnant with Amy. I take it you weren't going to the book club. Did you have a date? Now is not the time to cheat. Yes, it was. I'm sorry. Stacy started crying. Her tears did not touch him. Rick was both furious and sadder than he had ever been in his life. Are you leaving me? Stacy understood how serious this was. Oh my God. No, I want to stay. Please. I know I screwed up. I know that everything was terrible here, and for the most part, it's my fault. I want you to know that I want to rebuild our marriage and that I have never cheated on you physically. But you cheated emotionally, didn't you? Yes, I'm sorry, and I'm ashamed of myself. Tell me about it and tell me who he is. After you tell me, I'll decide if you and I have a chance. Stacy told Rick everything that led up to tonight, including what made her change her mind. No smoothing, no cheating. Rick listened without interrupting. When Stacy was done with her next apology, she couldn't wait any longer. That's it, Rick. You know everything. Now it's your turn. Tell me why you were at the turn. Rick told Stacy how he wanted to die and planned to end it all tonight. Before he was done, Stacy was on his lap, holding his head and crying on his chest. She looked into his eyes and begged, "Please, Rick, I love you. Let's dedicate ourselves to each other again and try to become friends and lovers again. I don't want to live without you." Rick was glad to hear that Stacy wanted to stay married, but had to ask, "How do we do this?" First, we swallow our pride and ask for help. There's not much pride in trying to kill yourself. And forgive me, there is absolutely no need to plan to meet your lover in some hotel. So pride shouldn't be a problem. Who should we turn to for help? Rick's comment about the hotel room stung, but Stacy knew she deserved it. We'll ask Mom. The last time she offered to lend us money, we were too proud and refused. She has money that she inherited after my grandfather's death. They're at the bank, and she offered to lend us what we need if we pay her the same interest rate that she gets at the bank, 3%. And we don't have to pay her the main debt until we get back on our feet. We will spend most of the money on paying off everything except the mortgage, and some of it will be spent on marriage counseling. We need help, Rick. We can't handle this on our own. Rick didn't agree to it that night. Stacy and Rick spent the next week discussing the pros and cons. In the end, they agreed, deciding that it would take an experienced third party to overcome the trust issues that each of them had. How could Rick learn to trust Stacy again after she committed emotional betrayal and was so close to physical betrayal? The thought of Stacy making love or even kissing another man made him feel sick. How could Stacy learn to trust Rick? Could she trust him with her life or their daughter's life? Stacy struggled to overcome her fear of what Rick might do. Other events took place before all this. Stacy returned to school on Friday morning, and in the third period, which was free for Stacy, all hell broke loose. Kyle walked into Stacy's classroom furious as a hornet. He didn't notice the two female students working on the bulletin board at the back of the classroom. "Where the hell were you last night? Not only was I forced to pay at the restaurant, but I was sitting there alone like some kind of asshole. I paid for the damn hotel room where I was waiting, straining with all my strength. In case you were late." Two little girls ran out of the classroom, and if Kyle had any sense, he would have run away. But he was on a roll and was still ranting and threatening when the deputy principal entered the classroom. She had to scream to get Kyle's attention. "Mississippi Wilson, Mr. Turner, come to my office immediately." The rumor of the quarrel spread like wildfire. Although all the facts were distorted, Danielle Miller thought it was the perfect time to overwhelm her with information from Uncle Fred. Anonymously, Danielle reported that Kyle Turner served, but was a clerk in the States, not our special forces hero. Everyone felt that Kyle had lied and stolen the honor, even if it was a lie about omissions. Many sympathy Kyle had hoped for quickly dissipated. His statements in the presence of these students and the threats overheard by the deputy director ruined him. Kyle left the same day without having a permanent job. Stacy felt better. She was scolded, but since she didn't break any school rules, she could stay with a warning to avoid any careless actions in the future. Stacy's mother actually borrowed the money. They really used them to pay their unpaid bills, and they really started going to a family counselor who helped them rediscover partnership and love. An important moment in recovery occurred a couple of months later. Stacy, Rick, and Amy were visiting Stacy's mom and dad. Stacy and the Colonel were in the study when everyone in the kitchen heard Stacy's raised voice. Dad, it's not Rick's fault that the economy went to hell and Amy was born prematurely. He supported my decision to quit my job and go back to school. He works over 50 hours a week at a job. He hates to help us stay afloat. He did nothing but be a faithful husband and a wonderful father. And if you can't respect such a person, then I feel sorry for you. If I hear from your mouth another disparaging remark about my husband, you will never see me or your granddaughter again. Stacy ran into the kitchen, grabbed Amy from her mother's arms and told Rick they were leaving. I will not listen to this man's insults anymore. I'm sorry, Mom. She went to the door and put Amy in the car seat. Rick kissed his mother-in-law on the cheek before following Stacy with a big smile on his face. It was the first time Stacy had stood up for him in front of the Colonel. It's hard to explain how this single incident changed Rick's self-esteem. His renewed faith in his marriage and in himself gave him the confidence to start looking for a better job with Stacy's support. 3 months after that day at his mother-in-law's, Rick was hired by an expanding credit union as head of corporate sales. By that time, the economy was gaining momentum, and thanks to a combination of salary and bonuses, Rick earned a little more than before he was fired. 2 years have passed since that fateful evening. The limited budget allowed the Wilson family to pay off more than half of what they owed Stacy's mother. A year of working with a consultant gave them the tools to be reliable and trust each other. Stacy no longer worried whenever Rick left the house with Amy, and Rick didn't worry at Stacy's book club parties. One evening, Rick came home to find his favorite dish on the stove and Amy was missing. Amy was at her grandparents'. The Colonel learned a long time ago to keep his mouth shut at his wife's insistence. If you think I'm going to let you keep me away from my granddaughter, there's something else waiting for you. Stacy asked Rick to sit down. Rick, I've been working on this and figured it out. I want a second honeymoon and a second child. Rick didn't know which of Stacy's demands stunned him more. Can we afford any of this? Stacy was glad Rick hadn't just said no. I've studied the offers and we can book 6 days in Jamaica for less than $2,000. Everything is included. What about Amy? Mom agreed to look after Amy. Rick smiled, thinking to himself how fun 6 days with his wife could be. The last time they spent more than one night alone was 4 years ago before Amy was born. Well, order this if you haven't done it yet. So, what about the second child? We have always said that we want at least 2. I was scared because of Amy's health problems, but I talked to my doctor and she said that the probability that our second child will be premature is less than 1 in 20. At most, women whose first child is premature have a full-term second pregnancy. Besides, my school insurance is much better than the one we had before. Even if there are complications, this time almost everything will be covered. Can I say yes to the holidays now and think a little about the second child?" Stacy agreed, and that's how they ended up back on the same beach in Jamaica 4 weeks later. On the plane to Jamaica, Rick surprised Stacy. "Leave the diaphragm alone this week, baby. Maybe we'll get lucky there and Amy will have a brother or sister." Stacy couldn't say a word. With tears in her eyes, she hugged and kissed Rick. "Thanks." If Rick was wondering if this trip could surpass their honeymoon, he had nothing to worry about. 5 minutes after they sat down in the lounge chairs, Stacy's top was taken off. At dinner that night, Stacy wore the most beautiful sundress imaginable. On the third morning, Stacy woke Rick up shortly after sunrise and dragged him to a stretch of beach where they had never been before. Stacy completely shocked Rick when she dropped the top and bottom of her bikini before running into the warm water. Rick shook off his stupor, took off his swimming trunks, and joined Stacy. They were both swimming near the shore. Rick had to ask, "How did you find out about this?" "That woman I was talking to last night, Janice, told me about it. She and her husband come here almost every morning." "Is it legal?" "Janice said that as long as you're dressed by 9, when the locals show up, no one cares. She told us to keep an eye on our costumes on the beach." One couple was surprised when some kids came and stole their costumes. Rick didn't like it, and he imagined how the hell they'd get back to their resort if all they had were Adam and Eve costumes. "Let's swim closer to the shore, just in case." Stacy laughed before turning around and swimming back to shore. When Rick caught up with Stacy, he had to ask, "Are we going to run into your friend and her husband? What if we get out of here by 8? That's why I woke you up so early." They spent the next half hour skinny dipping, kissing, and hugging. They didn't want to push their luck, so they put on their suits again and jogged back to the resort. Back in the room, they undressed, took a shower, dried off before returning to bed. Their second child, a boy they named Richard Jr., may have been conceived that morning. 8 months after returning from Jamaica, Stacy was sitting in her classroom preparing for her first lesson when a visitor unexpectedly came to her. She looked up from her notes and saw Angel Martinez standing in the doorway. "Mrs. Wilson, may I come in?" "Of course, Angel. What are you doing here?" "I'm going to be here in Lincoln for the next 12 weeks as a student teacher. I'm going to teach chemistry in Mr. Bauer's class." Stacy stood up and awkwardly hugged her former student. It was awkward because there was a baby in her stomach. "That's great. Mr. Bowers is a fantastic teacher. You'll learn a lot from him. And if you need me for anything, I hope I'll be here for a couple more weeks. I'm sorry to say this, Mrs. Wilson, but you look ready to give birth at any moment. I'm so happy for you and Mr. Wilson." "Yes, we are happy." When Stacy said that, she was actually thinking about how lucky she was that Angel had forgotten her ethics book years ago. Classes were about to start. The two women hugged and Angel left the room. "Thank you, Angel," Stacy whispered softly, not loud enough for Angel to hear. Many years later, on the eve of Amy's wedding, Stacy sat down next to her daughter and told Amy how close she was to committing adultery. She explained how disappointed she was in them because of their financial problems and why she felt entitled to make the biggest mistake of her life within an hour, a mistake that could destroy their family. She told Amy how hard they had worked to rebuild trust and marriage, how happy she was that Amy's father had forgiven her and given the marriage a second chance. In the end, the two women hugged and cried. The next morning, a few hours before the wedding, Amy approached her father. Dad, Mom told me what happened many years ago. I think she doesn't want me to make the same mistakes. What she couldn't tell me was why you didn't leave her. Rick wasn't surprised that Stacy shared her story with Amy. Although Rick had forgiven her a long time ago, Stacy had never completely forgiven herself. It was just like her to use her mistake to try to warn Amy against the temptations of life. Even if it meant exposing herself, well, it would have been much more difficult, if not impossible, if your mother had entered that hotel room. But she didn't do it. And your mother not only apologized for how close she came to cheating on me, but she also apologized for everything that preceded that evening. First of all, I spent my time thinking about what my life would be like without you and your mother. I'm sure I'd be lonely and sad. Instead, I've spent the last 20 years happier than anyone has a right to be, considering how close I came to messing everything up. What do you mean? Let's just say it was a difficult time in our marriage. Today is not a good day to go into all the mistakes that your father has made or almost made in his life. Let's have a great wedding today, and I promise that one day we'll have a drink, and I'll tell you why your mom is the best wife in the world. Amy didn't like it, but she agreed, and she silently swore that someday, very soon, she would buy her father this drink and hear his story. Rick wondered if he would tell Amy the whole story that no one else in the world knew about. How a few days after Stacy's confession, Rick kicked down the door of Kyle Turner's apartment, ready to kick the shit out of his ass, only to discover that Turner had already left town. And